It's the Real Faith for Real Life podcast. Hey, everybody, we got a great show ahead today. We're going to continue our series looking at finding balance. And we've got some great news stories to look at as well.
You bet. Hey, one of those is that we're tapping into the strategic reserves as a country, but it's not quite what you're thinking of.
And we're going to talk about worship music and how it just doesn't seem to have the same shelf life it used to. We'll talk about why and turn to the Bible for our study today, coming straight ahead. This is Real Faith for Real Life, a podcast from Cascade Fellowship in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
All right, hey, we're back with the news, and we are excited to connect news to our faith, and that's why we do this every single episode. And so we're starting off with a special story. We are tapping into our strategic reserves, but it's not quite what you're thinking of. Can you tell us some more
here?
Yeah,
in the news, of course, you're hearing a lot about the price of gas going up and oil. Not what this story is, not on this podcast. We only talk about fun things on this podcast. And, and this is how the news story started that I found online. In what's perhaps the most Canadian story of the year, the Quebec Maple Syrup Producers Group will soon release 50 million pounds of syrup from its strategic reserve.
Yes, I love it.
That's about half of its entire stockpile. So if you didn't know, Quebec produces roughly 70% of the world's maple syrup. And I don't know about you, I love maple syrup.
It's great.
This year, the producers just weren't able to keep up with the demand, which was up 20%. And so now they're having to tap into this reserve. And they're going to start tapping 7 million more trees in the near future to get the reserves back up to where they need to be. All right, so Eric, did you know that you can tap trees right here in Michigan as well to make maple syrup?
I mean, I guess I assumed you could, but I've never done it.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
I just heard this Sunday after church, someone stopped me and said the kids at Ada Christian School just up the road, they actually, class projects, they tap the maple trees every time of year, about this time of year.
That's really cool. So they're making their own syrup then too?
They're making their own syrup, and you can go there and get it. And I told them, save me a vial or a whatever they...
Bottle,
yes.
Yeah.
That's what I'm...
Probably not a vial.
That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
So, they love it because she told me the kids know it is spring because it's time to tap the trees again.
Yeah, that's
And they
cool.
connect it to God's creation and how awesome it is to see the way that God designed these trees. And it's just really neat.
Yeah.
I love nature. My wife loves nature, and what a great way to see God's provision for us.
Yeah, they better watch out, though. Canada's going to be calling and be like, hey, we need
That's
that
right.
syrup. Our reserves are low.
These kids are going to be rich.
Yeah, right. Get ready, Ada Christian. They're coming for you.
Right.
So you also said something about worship songs having a short shelf life these days.
Yeah. I saw this other article, and it was really interesting. I used to be a worship leader, I used to be a worship pastor for many, many years, in fact, before now being a lead pastor. And I saw this article, and it really resonated with me because I've served for about 2 decades, and I have noticed firsthand what this article said. It says worship songs just don't last as long as they used to. So the average lifespan of a worship song, a popular one, like 30 years ago, was 3 times as long as it is now. So there's basically this professor from Southern Wesleyan University, and he got inside CCLI, their database. Basically, it contains what churches are singing what songs. And after crunching all the numbers, he saw that the average time a church would sing a song has decreased from 12 years to 3 or 4.
Wow.
And I don't know. You're old enough to have lived through this change as well. Have you noticed it?
Yeah, so I remember growing up at Zion Church in Granville, and they had these hymnals, and we used to sing from the hymnals.
Right.
Even with an organ.
Retro, man.
Right? Kind of
so
crazy.
analog.
I know, yeah. It's kind of like hipster now, I guess, maybe.
That's right. Yeah.
But then again, like as I got older, some of the songs that we were singing, they were there, and then they were gone.
Right.
They weren't the ones that we repeated over and over again and kind of used as our kind of like anthem of our faith,
Yeah.
So.
And bringing some analysis into this story, I don't think it's all bad. I think we have to keep this in perspective. Like, music has always been changing. And, just think about the sheer number of hymns the greatest hymn writers wrote in their lifetime.
Yeah.
Obviously, not all of those hymns survive to today.
Right.
In our hymn books, we might just have a handful of hymns by that person. So it's always happening that more songs are being written than persevere. And I think we're just seeing that now. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the best part about it is no matter if it's an old song or a new song, it's worship to God. And as we come with a heart of worship before the Lord, if you're singing a song that was written 2 days ago or a song that was written 200 years ago, your posture before the Lord is really what matters.
Yeah, very good. Well, we're going to continue on in just a moment by turning to the Bible and looking at what it has to say about finding balance in a really important part of life, that is sharing the truth in love with one another. So we'll head into that next.
All right, we're continuing a study called Finding Balance here at Cascade Fellowship. Part 2 is about the balance between truth and love. It's a phrase that we find in Ephesians chapter 4. And so I would just like to take a moment and read that to kind of get us going down the right path together. Ephesians 4, starting in verse 14, says this: "Then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching, and by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become, in every respect, the mature body of Him who is the head, that is Christ. From Him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love, as each part does its work." So, Bill, get us started here. It's the phrase that many of us have heard at different stages, different places of life. And so that's, truth in love, sharing truth in love. It's interesting to read it in the context of Ephesians chapter 4. So maybe expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, we often divorce these popular phrases from their original context. So I think it's always helpful to put it back in its full context. And as you were reading, you're kind of emphasizing words like maturity and growth, and that's absolutely the correct context. So if you look at Ephesians chapter 4 as a whole, right at the top, the second verse is, "Be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing with one another in love." So these are virtues that we have to exhibit to be able to live together well, humility. We'll come back to that in a little bit. And then at the very end of the chapter, it's like bookends. It says again, "Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as Christ forgave you." So what we're reading, truth and love, it's in the context of, how in the world can we be unified and grounded and built up, edified, and I think this is how it happens.
Yeah, and so we have to recognize the key here, that there are two halves to this. There are two things, truth and love.
Right, and you need both, like you said, by emphasizing and, truth without love, it just doesn't get through. It's like, we'll expand on that a little bit more later as well. But truth without love is not effective, and love without truth is not effective. It just is kind of empty. It doesn't have anything worth saying. So, and by the way, just so you know, a little extra tidbit for everybody listening today, the word speak is actually not in the original language. So in the original Greek that Paul wrote, he turned truth, the noun, into a verb.
Okay.
So it's literally truthing in love.
Okay, all right.
Isn't that interesting? So it's like it's almost more than your speech. It's living in a truthful way. It's every part of your life being truthful is important. However, all that being said, truth is by nature facts, and you speak facts. And so I think the Bible translations are okay to say speaking the truth in love. That's what you do with truth. You speak it mainly. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Like you said, the key word here is and or in. A lot of people would say it's or. I think we live in a world where people assume like there's a choice. You get to be truth or you get to be love. And they feel like if you pick truth, you're choosing against love. Or if you pick love, you're choosing against truth. And they have to take sides. But I think on today's podcast, I hope to convince you they're not opposites. And they need to be held both simultaneously at the same time. So I don't know. What about you, Eric? Have you had some experience with, either you being at one extreme or you interacting with people who are at one extreme?
Yeah. I'm naturally very heart-driven as a person.
No.
Yeah, I know, right?
We talk about this all the time.
Yeah, right.
And here I am with my satire, my sarcasm, just like...
Hey, we make a good team, okay?
We do.
That's a piece of the story there. And so in my life, a lot of times, I'm always trying to err on the side of love. And it's in some ways, it's wrong because I'm just trying to do it to maintain a relationship. I could think of a bunch of different times, and I don't want to rat any of my friends out or something like that, where somebody's saying something and I'm just like, yup. Oh, yeah, Oh, I totally agree with you, because I don't want to make them feel bad.
Right.
I value that relationship more than I value the truth of the conversation or the truth of Jesus Christ. And, I'm a sinful person. I do that. Still to this day. But I see that regularly in our world around us too, this non-confrontational, I just want to love everybody so that nobody gets hurt and I can still have these relationships. So I tend to err on the side of love in some of those situations. So, I would guess then that maybe, I don't know, do you err on the side of truth or have you experienced truth? Like, what about you?
I'm an interesting case because it'll be both for me. Sometimes on one side, sometime on the other. But I will tell you this, like I mentioned earlier, I served as a worship musician and a worship leader, worship pastor for many years. And worship musicians receive a lot of truth and not a lot of love from people. And it was a struggle, not to say anything about anybody in particular, but the way people give you feedback about, got to have this particular type of song or this tempo or this loudness or this number or this length or this number of repeats or the temperature in the room. And it's just like, I received a lot of truth without love in that time. And so, I don't know if the folks listening have had that experience. It's really, really unfortunate that a lot of people have had that experience in church, whether you're the worship leader or not. Sometimes in church people can be very truthy, like one of the worst things that you can hear in a church is, brother, I just got to share some truth and love with you. That means brace yourself.
It's coming in.
Because here comes some really inappropriate, hurtful stuff.
Yep.
Anyway, those folks are usually the most insensitive and destructive and critical. It's really tough. And even beyond that, you're right. In the world today, there's a lot of people who are all love and no truth, but there's also a lot of people who are all truth and no love. And you need to look no further than your Facebook feed, right? Yeah. So look at any comment section ever, like every single one. You can make the most innocuous post, and you're going to start a World War III in your comment section. It's like a WWE cage match down there. Yeah. So this world definitely, from my point of view, struggles to hold those two things together.
Yeah. There's this desire to be right, and I
Absolutely.
think that plays a huge part into it. So, it's so rare to see truth and love together, like really married together these days. I think about politics. It's truth or love. And I think about, international relations, especially right now.
Right.
It's truth or it's love. Disinformation and manipulation is happening all around us. And I think that it almost feels like people have actually found ways to not be truthful and to not be loving more than they've done the work to be truthful and to be loving.
That's the story of our predominant headlines today. No truth and no love. And that's the world we're living in, unfortunately. So that makes it even more important for us as Christians, as Christ followers, to go against that tide, And I think that's one of the key ways we should be peculiar. People should notice we're different in this area. That's going to come across like we're light in the darkness. So unfortunately, as I've said before on this podcast, quite the opposite. Christians sometimes, unfortunately, are leading the league in disinformation, which is a shame, because if you're scrolling through your Facebook feed and one of your Christian friends is sharing something, you would hope they would know it's true before they share it, or they wouldn't be doing it. But Christians are falling for some of the stupidest disinformation out there, and I don't think pastors are talking about it enough. We have to commit ourselves to truth and be better about that. But you know what? We got to commit ourselves to love as well. So I like to think of it like this. We should be dedicated to truth because God is a God of truth. and we should be dedicated to love because God is a God of love.
Yeah.
So we're just emulating God in both of those things.
Yeah, I want to maybe even break from the path that we thought we were going to go on, because I think that the enemy really steps into this venue and says, wow, this is a playground for me. You know, I can cause somebody to feel threatened by the fact that they're not loving correctly, or they're going to share this disinformation and it's going to be truth and they have to be right. And we all need to be really aware in our spirits that the enemy is using this as a moment. And that's why Paul is writing about it too. Hey, listen, this is important in following Christ. Truth and love is important. And I know on Sunday you shared a ton of Bible verses. You know, and people listening, or if you're watching, you can go back, cascadefellowship.org, and check that out. But like on the podcast today, I think it'd be best if we just focused on like the practical takeaways. I'm a takeaway guy. I love takeaways and things that we can use to kind of like activate ourselves as disciples. And so, you know, the first thing that I would say in this, you know, is you got to really discern which way you're leaning. Applying this is really not easy, and finding the balance is going to be really hard work.
Yeah.
I heard somebody kind of describe following Christ as like this constant battle against sin and against the will of ourself. Almost like you have to put on your boxing gloves and like sweat as you follow and do. And so I want to know, like, what does it look like for us to really step into the ring and do this? Where in the world do we start?
You know, it's interesting. You mentioned something I hadn't thought of a lot before in preparation, and that is that we do have an enemy. His name is Satan, and he's the father of lies, you know. And so truth is of God, and lies and misinformation, disinformation, falsehood is of the enemy. And so part of growing is to realize you're fighting an enemy who has an agenda. And so you have to put on your armor, and you have to be ready for that. So in Reformed theology, we talk about the world and the devil and our sinful nature. All of these things are against us, and all of them are speaking lies into our brains and out of our lips into the world. So we have to fight that. And then we also have to realize that love is the other half of that, and there are all the forces against us there as well. So really, step one for application today, to make this practical, the place you have to start is you have to realize you as a person, you probably lean naturally one way or the other. There are truth people and there are love people. And most of us don't have this balance perfect. So you lean one way or the other. Just acknowledge that. And then decide that these two come together as a package deal. So because we know God's truth, we're called to be loving. And because we love people, we're going to share the truth with them. They just can't be broken apart. So Eric, I got a few more verses for you here. I found 3 verses that actually hold both of these concepts together right there in the same verse, just to prove they're a package deal.
All right.
So 1 Corinthians 13:6, Paul says, love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. So yeah, love and truth married together, not opposed to each other. Deuteronomy 6:4, the most fundamental part of Judaism, the Shema. They memorized this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That's truth. That's a truth claim. Our God, this is a monotheistic religion. We believe this about God. This is true. Very next thing, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. Truth and love.
Right.
And then finally, just this morning, I was just thinking about this verse. It just came to mind. 1 Peter 3:15, but in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope you have. We're talking about facts here. We're talking about reasons. We're talking about logic. We're talking about defense, truth. But that's not all the verse says. There's another half. But do this with gentleness and respect. That attitude of love. So you don't come over and clobber them and try to argue them into the kingdom of God, but you do it with gentleness and respect, truth and love.
Yeah, I really like that. So one of the places that I think about applying this is within the worshiping community, within the church. And so, you know, maybe that's the first application we can touch on right here. How do you show truth and love within your worshiping community?
Yeah, I think Ephesians 4 implies, and we know by experience, that it can be hard to get along with other human beings. And just because you're inside the four walls of a church doesn't change the fact that we are all sinful, even myself and everybody else I encounter in church, right? So that's why Paul has to tell us over and over and over and over again in his letters to put up with each other. That's a good translation.
Yeah,
put
right.
up with each other, bear with one another, right? So, for instance, as we read the verses that we read earlier, we notice, remember I said we'd come back to this. It says, be completely humble. Humble. Humility is the ground from which all of this blooms, you know. So I think if we could just get that one attitude right, almost all the other problems would go away. Humility. Mm-hmm. So humility in love, obviously, but also humility in truth. That sounds weird for a pastor to say, right? Because we know the truth. We should hold strong to the truth. But mix in with that, 1 Corinthians 13:12, Paul says, for now we see us only as a reflection in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. So you may be more familiar with the older translation, through a glass darkly. You know, the things that we're so sure of, well, some things we can be really, really sure of, but a lot of things we have to hold a little bit loosely. And one of the commentaries I read this week called it the humility of partial knowledge. So even as we're presenting truth claims to people, we have to realize, you know what, we have humility even in making this truth claim. So yeah, that verse I just read, 1 Corinthians 13, seeing through a glass darkly, you may not realize it, but what is that chapter about? That's the famous love chapter that's read at all these weddings, right? So it's a chapter all about defining what love is. And right smack dab in the middle of it is like this call for humility. Like you don't know it all. Hold on to your truth claims just a little bit loosely here. Have a little bit of humility.
I like that.
That's what love looks like, especially in church where we're just so certain we know everything, you know, and I would just say this to our folks listening today, it works. If you want no other reason to try this out, try it because it works. You want to be practical? Truth in love works. So Eric, if I were to come to you with an idea and just lay it on you and force it on you, how would you react?
It'd be really tricky to receive that. It'd be hard probably to want to trust you and partner with you. It would just kind of like make the relationship rough.
Yeah.
For sure.
Most people, human nature is to react oppositionally and push back, right? You push back reflexively. But if I come at you with love and humility, doing a lot of listening, making it clear I have your best interest at heart, now how do you receive it?
Yeah, it feels more like a partnership, a friendship, an ability to think and dream and do together.
Right. So in church and in all these other application areas we'll talk about, it just works, right? So love takes longer. It feels like it's initial investment of time, but it's really long is short and short is long with people. Fast is slow and slow is fast with people, right? So that initial investment of true love, not manipulative love, but true love is really the best way to get that truth across. And part of that is just the discipline of knowing when it's not time. Not time yet. Dietrich Bonhoeffer has this great quote about the ministry of holding your tongue.
Yeah, right.
And I think that's beautiful. Being committed to truth and love doesn't mean truth 24/7 all the time, everywhere.
Right.
But sometimes it means, I got to hold on to this for a little bit and make sure this person knows I love them first. So
yeah, I mean, it's hard to not just think like truth almost doesn't have a place in it. It does have a place, right? I mean, like truth can be very divisive, and we don't want to divide by any means, but sometimes we kind of have to because God's truth is true,
Right.
But, where do you draw the line? How do you know when to hold your tongue, love the person, and stay unified? Or how do you know when it's time to speak up, even at the risk of dividing a relationship or a group of people?
Right. Yeah, that's that balance again. And it's so subjective to know where to draw that line. The NIV commentary says this: the emphasis on unity does not mean unity at any cost. Unity is not the goal. Unity in Christ is the goal. And that unity comes from a shared faith and a shared knowledge of Christ. Therefore, there are limits to unity. The church and its unity are always Christologically and theologically defined. Even within that, though, where do you draw the line?
Right.
So obviously our sister denomination, the RCA, has been split down a line. If you look at our heritage, we split from the RCA over some pretty stupid stuff hundreds of years ago. Take it all the way back to Jesus. We have hundreds and hundreds of denominations. Each one of them has split over various things, usually very small things. And so the question for every time that's about to happen is like, is this really essential? Do we have to divide to keep our truth 100% pure? Or can we be a little humble with that and say, okay, you're trying to read the Bible, I'm trying to read the Bible. We're both really committed to the Bible. We have we don't see it exactly the same way, but we can stay in fellowship with each other. Yeah. Now, where you draw that, again, I'm not making any claim about where you draw that line.
Yeah.
People draw that line in different places. But at the end of the day, I would love, as a pastor, if the church is known more for its love than its fights. And I think it's the opposite right now.
Yeah. There's a part of me that looks forward to, going to heaven one day. Well, there's a lot of part of me that looks forward to going to heaven someday. But also just this realization of God really explaining all of those things that we were divided on and being like, not only were you wrong, but you were wrong too, because my spirit's doing so much more in the middle of this that you don't even know, And so we have to be, known for our love, not for our fights. I love that phrase. That's worth repeating again and again and again in your houses and wherever we go. But so let's think about our houses here. Let's talk about, marriage or personal relationships. You read a quote to our staff this week, and I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing that here too.
Yeah, church staff is ironically a lot like a marriage. Worship teams also a lot like a marriage. I use these applications interchangeably, but check it out. This is also from the NIV application commentary. Every couple should make an unbreakable vow to always speak the truth in love. Every parent and child should make the same unbreakable vow. Love may seem out of place in business ethics, but the guideline for business, too, is speaking the truth in love. Churches and pastors, too, have the same path, whether dealing with the shallowness of a self-proclaimed good person or with someone struggling with cancer. Truth in love is all we have. So with regard to marriage specifically, here's what I've learned, Eric. I don't know if you've learned the same thing, but marriage takes more than truth. A marriage built on only truth doesn't cut it, right?
Right.
And I have exactly 1 half hour every day to be right. And that's when we watch Jeopardy.
When you watch Jeopardy. Yeah.
We have a nightly ritual of watching Jeopardy, and I usually do pretty good.
Oh,
My brain just stores like random useless facts super well.
It's fun. I like it.
But seriously, truth is important, but maybe even more so how you say it, right? So a common dynamic in marriage is people just stuff the truth down.
Yep.
So they're afraid it will be unloving to say, and they want to be loving, so they don't say it, and they just keep pushing it down and pushing it down. And those things don't go away. They just fester and get worse until eventually they erupt in a super unloving way. So I believe we have to be committed in marriage to love and truth all along the way, even when it's hard, and both sides can be hard. And, that requires being vulnerable. It requires trust. It requires Christ-like love, agape love, like we talked about in this week's sermon, when the person knows that you have their back, you know everything about them, you know all their faults, but you're still choosing to be with them anyway. That kind of love makes truth-telling possible.
Yeah. And so you mentioned business in the quote above too. So I guess I want to think about truth and love in the workplace, in business. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So just again, practically speaking, servant leadership is what it's all about, not just in churches, but in businesses. So look at the world today. It's not the Industrial Revolution anymore. Workers are not content to sit on a factory line and make widgets. They want to make a difference, right? So as leaders, we have to lovingly develop our people, help them reach their goals. And sometimes that includes sharing the truth and all along the way doing it in a loving way. So, who wants to work for a boss who's self-centered, always right, and angry, but who also wants to work for a boss who's spineless and doesn't tell you anything? So truth and love in business works there too.
Yeah. One last application, missions.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about this in the sermon. I'll add to what I said this quote. There's this German poet who's a skeptic of Christianity. And he said this: "You show me your redeemed life, and I might be inclined to believe in your Redeemer. And I think that's a great quote. It's like, as we share the gospel, as we're on the mission field, people see the Redeemer in our redeemed lives. So it's not just about truth. It's not about dropping scriptures on them like a bomb, but it's living them out in a loving way. And even in our own denomination, our magazine, The Banner, the editor-in-chief wrote this beautiful article this month, and he said, I don't think throwing more facts and intellectual arguments at each other is going to solve the problem. But he reminds us that what we do, and specifically how we make people feel, is more memorable. And in the long run, it's more memorable than anything we say or anything we argue about. So what we need, he says, is higher emotional intelligence more than IQ. We need EQ more than IQ. And I would tend to agree. I think we're about out of time. I would love to recommend some reading to folks, though.
Yeah.
And there's this great article I came across in the Christian Century. So if you Google the words, I'm a philosopher, we can't think our way out of this mess. Oh, what a great article by a guy named James K.A. Smith. And he's basically echoing that same argument that analysis is not going to get us out of where we are in the world today. More good arguments, more thinking is ultimately not what we need. He was a graduate student in philosophy, and he built his whole academic career on defending, these precise arguments. And he fell into a hole of depression. And guess what got him out of that? It wasn't more thinking. It wasn't precision in the thought process. It was a friend who loved him enough to jump down in the pit with him. And man, what a great place to end our study today, just to remind each other. That's what it's about. Living in Christian community is to get in the pit with each other, to get in the trenches with each other. That's what love is. And then when you're there, to share the truth and get out together.
Yeah. So next week, we're going to dive into another area that needs balance. Are Christians to be content, or are they to be ambitious? Content. Ambition, right? So this is a great topic.
What do you think, Eric?
I have some thoughts, but I also really kind of want to dive into that Jeopardy comment. Maybe we need to have a little
show,
a little competition. Maybe that's next week's news. Bill's on Jeopardy.
That would be great.
So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on anything we're doing here. We love to have you throw in your comments and some questions that you have too. You can just reach out to us here at church. But we look forward to having you join us again next week.
Yeah, and remember, if you find this podcast helpful, leave us a review, recommend it to your friends. And we look forward to next week. We'll see you then.